Welcome back to the deep dive. We are jumping straight into a story today that, well, it challenges pretty much every modern assumption we hold about success, strategy, and power. We are looking at a military scenario, an ancient one, where the leader took an army that was already, frankly, woefully small, and deliberately cut it down by 99%.
Yeah, it sounds like military suicide, doesn't it?
It really does. We're talking about a reduction from 32,000 fighting men down to just 300. It's the paradoxical account of Gideon in the book of Judges. And our source material calls this Gideon's reduction, God's power in weakness.
That's right. And our mission in this deep dive is really to extract the core insights from a pretty comprehensive theological and historical analysis of that specific chapter, Judges 7. We want to move beyond just retelling the story. We need to understand why this radical, almost unbelievable military choice was made.
What was the logic?
Exactly. What specific logic drove the reduction? And maybe more importantly, what this story argues about the true nature of strength and how we even attribute success in the first place.
And the narrative itself, right after the cuts, it sets up the situation by saying there was, and this is a quote, no human chance of victory. And that phrase feels like the absolute key here, doesn't it? We have to unpack why eliminating, all human probability of success wasn't just some unfortunate side effect of the plan, but was, in fact, the entire deliberate point of the whole exercise.
Precisely. And that brings us to the core question the source really insists we answer. Why would divine intervention seem to require such an extreme reduction? The analysis asserts pretty definitively it wasn't like a test of loyalty in the usual sense or some kind of punishment. It was actually a preemptive measure.
Preemptive? How so?
To humble Israel, to ensure that when the outcome, the victory, finally arrived, the source of that power was just undeniable. Completely non-negotiable.
Okay, so before we can even begin to appreciate this, the sheer insanity of the numbers involved in the reduction, we first have to establish the reality Gideon was facing. The reduction only makes sense if we grasp the terrifying scale of the threat, right?
Absolutely. The historical context is crucial here. Israel was, they were under the thumb of the Midianites, a nomadic people, a powerful force that had been absolutely devastating the land for 7 long years. And this wasn't a conventional war, where 2 armies line up on a field. It was more like an ongoing, demoralizing campaign of oppression.
Like guerrilla warfare, almost, but on a massive scale.
Sort of, but it was timed. The Midianites would sweep in right after the harvest, steal all the crops, take the livestock, basically starve the population into submission, year after year.
Wow. So the source material paints this picture of complete collapse.
Yeah.
Economic, psychological.
Total collapse. The Israelites were so terrorized they had actually retreated from their towns and villages. They were hiding out in caves, mountain strongholds, just living hand to mouth.
So that context shows that Gideon was already scraping the bottom of the barrel just to get his initial 32,000 men together. It wasn't like he had a huge pool to draw from.
Exactly. And that army, the 32,000, had to contend with this immense opposing force. The text itself, it uses almost poetic language to describe the enemy. It mentions the Midianites, the Amalekites, other eastern peoples, saying they were lying in the valley like locusts in multitude, just swarming.
Locusts. Yeah, that gives you a sense of overwhelming numbers.
But the most evocative description, the one that immediately sets the scale, is about their camels. It says their camels were countless as the sand on the seashore.
Okay, yeah, that specific visual just stops you cold. It's not meant to be literal, obviously, but it conveys impossibility, doesn't it?
Utter impossibility.
Imagine standing on some ancient ridge looking down and seeing not, distinct military units you can count, but just an unmeasurable, overwhelming sea of enemies stretching beyond the horizon.
Living tide of opponents.
Yeah. A force so vast, so seemingly endless, that your 32,000 men suddenly look like a tiny footnote, a rounding error.
The ratio of defense to threat was already catastrophically bad from the start. Any military strategist would say they were doomed.
And this is exactly where that conflict with human strategy just detonates.
Completely. By every measure of tactical sense, by what the source calls human logic. If you are facing a literal sea of enemies, your only goal has to be aggregation.
You need more bodies, more swords, more everything.
You maximize resources, you call up reserves. You use every single able body you can possibly find just to try and minimize that insane disparity. Military doctrine across all of history screams for a larger force in this situation. always.
The immediate, shocking, completely counterintuitive instruction Gideon receives from the divine source rejects this logic entirely.
Or rose it out.
It's the ultimate paradox. You have too many men.
Can you imagine hearing that?
Seriously, if you're Gideon, you're facing this existential threat, you already feel hopelessly outnumbered, and then you hear that you are overstaffed. It must sound like madness, like a deliberate plan for annihilation.
The sheer audacity of that statement, you have too many men, that's the entire setup for the miracle that follows. And the source spends quite a bit of time analyzing the explicit reason given for this seemingly self-defeating reduction. It's not presented as some vague spiritual test, you know. The motive is stated plainly. It's very doctrinal.
And what is that stated reason?
God says directly, I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me, saying, my own strength has saved me.
Okay, let's just pause and unpack that sentence, because that's a staggering insight into the priority system at play here.
It really is.
The primary strategic goal shifts completely. It's not military victory anymore, which they desperately need for survival. The main goal becomes the prevention of pride.
Exactly. The focus is ensuring Israel does not take credit. It's not about whether they can win. It's about who gets the credit when they inevitably do win.
So the victory itself is almost assumed, but the attribution is the variable.
Precisely. We have to try and view this through that ancient covenantal lens. If 32,000 men had somehow won against that horde, well, it would have been rationalized, wouldn't it?
Yeah, people would say, wow, Gideon was a brilliant leader, or Israel just has this inherent fighting spirit, or our collective training and courage carried the day.
Exactly. The victory would absolutely be attributed to human capability, human resilience, maybe exceptional martial effort. It would become a story about them.
So the divine concern isn't actually the possibility of failure here. The divine concern is the probability of misplaced credit. It's an issue of attribution, pure and simple.
It's like the ultimate theological hedge, isn't it? If only 300 men succeed against countless thousands, well, there's just zero human explanation left on the table. None.
It removes all other variables.
It forces the conclusion.
Yeah.
The only plausible, rational conclusion left is divine intervention. The source argues that God wasn't actually reducing their chance of victory. He was reducing their chance of pride. The reduction was really an operation aimed at the human heart, you could say, not primarily at the battlefield logistics.
But hang on, a question comes up here. If God is omnipotent, all-powerful, why is this elaborate process necessary? Why couldn't he simply grant the victory to the 32,000 and then just, command them not to boast, tell them afterwards?
Right.
Why go through this incredibly painful, risky process of subtraction just to ensure the correct attribution later?
That's an excellent point, and the source suggests this might be less about God's need for recognition and more about Israel's need for clarity.
Okay.
Humans, we are inherently prone to confusing outcome with effort, especially when success seems even remotely plausible through our own means. If success is within the realm of human explanation, even if it's a long shot, then the moral and theological lesson, the absolute reliance on divine power, inevitably gets muddled or lost entirely.
So humiliation in this context actually becomes a teaching tool, a pedagogical tool.
That's how the source frames it. The removal of the 31,700 men was essentially removing all the variables that would allow Israel to rationalize the success based on their own merits. Their numbers, their courage, their strategy. It forces the remaining few, and the nation watching, to acknowledge that the only factor left in the equation is the divine one. It isolates the cause.
So the lesson starts right there. The possibility of self-reliance, of saying my own strength saved me, is actually considered a greater threat to God's ultimate purpose than the entire Midianite army itself.
That's a powerful way to put it.
It suggests that maybe in our own lives, when we feel overwhelmingly outnumbered or out-resourced, sometimes the thing being reduced isn't really our chance of success, but maybe our capacity for self-glorification.
The possibility for pride is being surgically removed.
Wow, that's a really powerful reframing of weakness, isn't it?
Right. So with that theological rationale firmly established the absolute necessity of eliminating human boasting, we move into the actual mechanics of the reduction. How did it happen? And this wasn't just, a random cut. It was a carefully orchestrated two-stage process. It seems designed to refine the army based on very specific psychological and behavioral criteria.
Okay, stage one. And it began by targeting the most basic human response to overwhelming threat. Fear, pure fear.
Yes, stage one is often called the release of the fearful. Gideon is given this command to address the entire 32,000-man assembly, and he's told to simply announce, Anyone who was afraid, anyone who was trembling with fear. But maybe complacency or lack of situational awareness.
Okay, this brings us to stage 2, the famous water test, often framed as the test of alertness. This is probably the most famous and I guess the most debated part of the whole story.
Absolutely. It's iconic. God leads the remaining 10,000 men down to a body of water. A critical moment, obviously, because all soldiers needed hydration, especially after a march in that climate. But the source argues this wasn't really a test of thirst or how fast they could drink. It was a test of posture, a test of priority, revealed in how they drank.
Right, explain the distinction. How did they get sorted?
The distinction was drawn between two very different groups and behaviors. The vast majority, 9,700 men, they knelt down, they probably put their weapons aside, maybe leaned them against a rock. They submerged their faces right down into the water and drank deeply, comfortably, focused solely on getting that immediate physical relief.
Which sounds sensible? Efficient, maybe?
From one perspective, yes. But the source interprets this as representing a kind of vulnerability, a momentary surrender to comfort, assuming safety, lowering their guard completely.
Okay, and then there were the others, the tiny minority.
And then there were the few, just 300, who demonstrated a completely different behavior. They're described as lapping water with their hands.
Lapping? Like a dog?
Well, maybe more like scooping it up quickly with their hands, bringing the water to their mouths. The key thing is they remained upright, or at least crouched. They kept their heads up. They maintained vigilance of their surroundings, still scanning the area, ready to spring into action instantly. They didn't fully disengage from a state of readiness.
Now, I have to push back here a little again. Isn't this interpretation highly subjective? Couldn't the soldiers who knelt down simply be practicing disciplined hydration, conserving energy for the fight ahead? Why is this specific kind of situational awareness suddenly prioritized over maybe physical endurance or following orders or proper military discipline in other ways?
That's really the crux of the analysis, isn't it? The source argues forcefully that this test wasn't about finding the best soldier in a conventional military sense, the strongest, the fastest, the best shot. It was about finding the most focused soldier, the most mission-oriented.
Focused how?
The soldiers who knelt down, arguably, were treating the moment as a break, a pause, They were assuming safety, letting their guard down. The 300, however, were treating it as just a brief, necessary pause within combat readiness. They never mentally checked out. So the distinction, the source suggests, lies in their inherent priorities at that moment. For the 9,700, immediate deep comfort and relief took precedence over vigilance. For the 300, the mission, the state of alertness, superseded even that desperate need for water. They were disciplined enough, you could say, to resist total immersion in personal comfort.
Okay, so it's fundamentally a test of readiness then. A moment of vulnerability needing water reveals who remains fundamentally mission-oriented versus who becomes comfort-oriented, even briefly.
Precisely. And this seemingly small behavioral difference, how they drank water, results in the final, truly radical reduction. The 9,700 who sought that deeper comfort are sent home.
Leaving just 300 men.
Just 300. The hyper-alert, the mission-focused, the non-complacent core.
The final numbers are just astonishing when you lay them out. 32,000 reduced by fear down to 10,000. And then those 10,000 reduced by, let's call it complacency or lack of focus, down to a mere 300.
The subtraction is finally complete. Utterly complete.
And it's only with this minimum, this psychologically and spiritually refined force, that the divine assurance is finally delivered with conviction. With the 300 men, I will save you.
And what's so fascinating here, as the source points out, is that the creation of this mathematical impossibility is entirely intentional. It's the whole point. 300 men against an army described like countless grains of sand. The numbers don't just not work. They actively scream failure, utter certain failure by human standards.
And that failure of human logic is the stage.
It becomes the deliberately constructed stage required for the divine glory to be utterly unmistakable when the victory comes. There can be no other explanation.
The stage is set, 300 focused men, but the weaponry they choose next, or rather, are given, just further underscores this entire theme of weakness enabling power. It gets even stranger.
Right, so at this point, Gideon has his 300 men. They are highly motivated, hyper-alert, totally dependent. But they are facing these overwhelming odds. Now, if they had then been armed with, superior weaponry, advanced armor, some secret weapon, a victory might still somehow be attributed back to their skill or technology, right?
Perhaps. But the source material goes out of its way to note their shocking military deficiency at this point. They were deliberately stripped of almost all traditional military means.
No swords.
The source explicitly notes the 300 had no swords. Think about that. An army with no primary offensive weapons. They were equipped purely for disruption and illusion maybe, not for sustained combat.
They were armed with the tools of theater almost. Psychological warfare. Exactly. Tools of noise and light, not tools of war as they knew it.
Okay, let's detail this unconventional arsenal because it's absolutely crucial to understanding the strategic purpose here. What did they actually have?
3 things per man. A trumpet, specifically a shofar, a ram's horn, an empty clay jar, and a torch concealed inside the jar.
So a noisemaker, a brittle container designed to be broken, and a hidden light source. That's it. That's the entire inventory for defeating a massive, professional, well-armed, camel-mounted army.
That's the inventory. And the significance of these specific non-military tools has to be understood in context, as the source explains. The trumpet, the shofar, served as the sound of authority, of command. Hearing hundreds of them blast at once would suggest the arrival of a huge, organized attacking force.
Okay, and the jars?
The clay jars served simply to conceal the burning torches until the exact right moment. This ensured that the appearance of light would be sudden, simultaneous, and shocking, not gradual.
And the torches themselves?
The torches, suddenly revealed all around the camp, created the visual illusion of thousands upon thousands of enemy soldiers encircling them, lighting up the night. Noise and light multiplied by 300 points.
So the very lack of traditional weaponry becomes the ultimate statement on attribution, doesn't it?
Absolutely. If these men had won a stunning victory with swords, the boast might still have been, "We were few, but we were the best fighters. Our skill prevailed."
Right. But by winning with just noise and light, the only possible conclusion is that the ensuing panic wasn't rational. It had to be supernatural or divinely inspired, something external to the men's own fighting prowess.
It essentially forces the Midianites to defeat themselves, which leads us right into the detailed analysis of the tactical action, the midnight strategy. The 300 surrounded the vast, sleeping Midianite camp in the dead of night, not to breach the perimeter and fight hand-to-hand, but to orchestrate this massive, synchronized psychological shockwave.
Describe the sequence. The source lays it out quite dramatically. The coordination must have been perfect?
Absolutely perfect. The 300 men took positions, likely in 3 groups of 100, surrounding the sprawling, sleeping camp below. Then, at Gideon's signal, the coordination had to be instantaneous and flawless across all points. First, they shattered the clay jars simultaneously. Imagine the sudden, loud, terrifying crash of hundreds of pottery containers breaking all at once in the dead quiet.
Startling, disorienting.
Immediately followed by the sudden blazing appearance of the concealed torches. Darkness to blinding light from every direction.
Panic sets in.
And finally, they all blew the trumpets, the shofars, at the exact same instant. A deafening blast from hundreds of horns, and they shouted together, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon," even though they held no swords themselves.
Wow. Just try to imagine the sensory overload for a sleeping Midianite soldier deep inside that camp.
It's terrifying. You wake up in pitch darkness to this unbelievable cacophony. A deafening crash, trumpets blaring from what sounds like hundreds, maybe thousands of points all around you.
Yeah.
Sudden light flashing into your eyes from every direction.
And the shouting.
And the shouting about swords. The combination of noise, light, and the shock of seeing what absolutely looked like an overwhelming enemy encirclement appearing out of nowhere in the darkness. It created instant mass hysteria.
Total chaos.
And the strategy was genius in a way, precisely because it weaponized the enemy's own greatest strength, their sheer numbers. Panic swept through that massive Midianite camp like wildfire. Because they were so numerous and so completely disoriented by the sensory assault, they couldn't coordinate. They couldn't identify the real threat, which was just 300 guys holding lights and horns on the hillsides.
They couldn't tell friend from foe in the dark?
Exactly. The consequence was catastrophic internal collapse. The Midianites, believing they were under massive attack from a huge coordinated force surrounding them, couldn't distinguish their own allies running around in panic from these phantom attackers. The text notes grimly that the enemies literally turned their swords on one another. They started fighting and killing each other in the darkness and confusion.
Their immense strength, their numbers, became their fatal weakness in that moment of panic.
Precisely. By morning, the battle was essentially over. Israel had the victory. A victory achieved not through a single sword stroke from Gideon's men, but through a mass panic attack induced by noise and light.
The 300 didn't need swords because the enemy carried out the required combat on themselves.
And the source material is absolutely adamant in reiterating the ultimate attribution here. It circles right back to that core lesson established at the beginning. The victory was, quote, not because of Gideon, not because of strategy, at least not strategy as any conventional military mind would understand it.
So what was it then?
The foundational principle revealed by the entire process from the initial reduction right through to this bizarre victory is summarized in that powerful declaration from Zechariah, which the source connects here, not by might, nor by power, but by my spirit. Every single step of Gideon's reduction, every unconventional choice, ensured that this truth was the only possible logical conclusion left standing.
It provides the ultimate historical case study then for this idea that true, undeniable power is often revealed most clearly only when human effort, human might, human strategy is rendered statistically irrelevant or even absurd.
It's like the ultimate zero-sum equation, isn't it? If
Yeah.
you deliberately subtract the human element, the numbers, the weapons, the conventional tactics, until the chance of success basically equals zero.
Then any result other than total failure must be attributable to something outside that human equation, something divine.
Yeah.
Okay, so this brings us squarely to the application. The so what's for us, for the learner listening today. We've dissected this historical and theological narrative, and it seems extreme, almost alien in its logic. But we have to revisit that central philosophical challenge the source really wants us to wrestle with and carry forward. What if? What if the very things we identify in our own lives as disadvantages? You know, the reductions we face, the lack of resources, the smallness of our influence, maybe physical limitations. What if those are actually the prepared ideal stage for a kind of breakthrough that simply cannot be explained away by our own effort?
This is really the moment where the narrative analysis connects directly to its broader theological echo. It bridges the Old Testament story to a New Testament principle. The source immediately jumps forward centuries in its analysis to introduce a really relevant New Testament scripture to Corinthians 12.9 to show that Gideon's reduction wasn't just some isolated strange event back then, but that it was actually an early dramatic articulation of a foundational divine principle about how God often chooses to work.
And that quote is critical for understanding this whole paradigm shift, isn't it? Can you share it?
Yes. Paul is quoting God speaking to him. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness.
My power is made perfect in weakness.
If you place that scripture, like a lens, over the map of Gideon's campaign, it provides the interpretation key. The weakness, the radical reduction to 300, the lack of swords, the reliance on jars and torches wasn't a flaw to be overcome. It wasn't an obstacle, it was the prerequisite, the necessary condition for the perfect display of God's power.
So if power is truly made perfect in weakness, then strength, competence, self-sufficiency, they inherently serve to obscure that perfect display. They muddy the waters.
That's the implication. Human strength, human adequacy, tends to take the credit, or at least share it. Weakness and inadequacy leaves the stage entirely clear for God's power to be seen for what it is, undiluted.
Okay, so let's connect this to the bigger picture, the application for the modern listener, maybe someone facing their own Midianite army of challenges. The source suggests we might need to seriously reevaluate our standard metrics for success or even for readiness, the size of your army, and that could mean your current financial resources, your team's talent pool, your political connections, your social influence, maybe even your physical health.
All the things we usually try to maximize.
Right, all the things we think we need to accumulate before we can succeed. The source suggests the size of that army may be utterly irrelevant to the ultimate success of your God-given mission.
In fact, it goes further. Accumulating too much of that human army, relying too heavily on it, might actually be the greatest obstacle to experiencing the kind of victory that compels testimony. The kind of victory where people look and say, wow, that couldn't have been just them.
Think about the struggles so many people face, maybe you're facing right now. The entrepreneur whose funding suddenly falls through at the last minute, the artist whose best work keeps getting rejected, the community leader whose established network just collapses unexpectedly.
Yeah, or personal health setbacks, job losses, things that feel like punitive setbacks, like a forced reduction of resources, capability, or influence.
Exactly, and they feel like failure. They feel like the end of the road.
But this analysis raises a really important, maybe unsettling question. For anyone facing a challenge where they feel completely inadequate, completely outnumbered, is it possible that the reduction in what you currently possess isn't actually a sign of failure? But maybe. Maybe it's a sign that the stage is being meticulously set.
Set for what?
Set for a demonstration of power that transcends your current capabilities. Is God, perhaps, reducing your ability to rely on yourselves, on your own strength or resources, so that when the breakthrough or the success finally comes, there's simply no question in your mind or anyone else's where it came from? It had to be Him.
That's a profound shift in mindset.
Yeah.
Because we are so culturally conditioned, especially today, to view self-reliance, capability, having all the resources lined up as the highest virtue, the key to success.
Right. Grit, determination, resourcefulness.
Gideon's story just flips that completely on its head. It suggests that maybe total dependence, acknowledging inadequacy, is actually the pathway to the most undeniable kind of success.
It implies that if you are struggling right now with feeling inadequate for a task God has put before you, that feeling of inadequacy might, paradoxically, be the perfect qualification for the job.
But it's important to remember the state of the 300, right? They weren't passive, they weren't complacent.
Not at all. That's crucial. They were the opposite of complacent. They were hyper-alert. They were the remnant who implicitly understood that their survival depended entirely on following instructions precisely, on outside intervention. They had passed through the filter that eliminated paralyzing fear, stage 1, and the filter that eliminated comfort-seeking complacency, stage 2. Only the dependent and alert remained.
And maybe that refinement process is often what we experience during those intense periods of scarcity or challenge in our own lives. The fear is dealt with, the complacency gets stripped away.
Leaving you reliant and focused, ready for instructions you wouldn't have heard otherwise.
So the summary lesson of Gideon's 300, therefore, boils down to something simple, but it's universally challenging, isn't it?
It is. Sometimes the most necessary, most strategic action is subtraction, before the multiplication can occur.
The subtraction removes the human ability to boast, clears the stage.
Ensuring that the multiplication, the eventual victory or breakthrough, can only be explained by that divine variable entering the equation.
So the deep dive really suggests that when you look at an apparent reduction in your life, maybe a loss of influence, a diminished platform, a constrained budget, a relationship ending, a physical limitation, perhaps you're not failing.
Perhaps you're simply in the Gideon phase of the story. The loss of those variables, the shrinking of your army, might just be setting the stage for an outcome that will defy all rational explanation based on your remaining resources. #OutroF.
Well, this has been a genuinely fascinating and I think deeply provocative deep dive into Gideon's reduction. We kick things off by establishing the almost unimaginable scale of the Midianite threat and enemy described like countless sand on the seashore, and then we followed this shocking, completely counterintuitive path to victory. We watched an army deliberately shrink from 32,000 down to just 300 men.
A 99% cut, still staggering to think about.
And then saw those 300 achieve an impossible success using only the psychological weaponry of noise and light. No swords needed.
And we've really explored how this ancient story serves as maybe the ultimate precedent for this radical idea that weakness isn't just something to overcome, but can be the perfect canvas for demonstrating overwhelming power. The entire elaborate, almost bizarre set of steps, that two-stage reduction, it was all seemingly about ensuring that attribution for the victory was correctly given. It transformed a military campaign into an enduring testimony.
Yeah, the lesson seems to be that eliminating our grounds for self-reliance, for boasting, is often the most important strategic step we, or maybe God, can take.
And we connected that historical narrative to the theological cornerstone from the New Testament, that God's power is indeed made perfect in weakness.
It's challenging all of us, really, to look at our own deficiencies, our own areas of inadequacy, not necessarily as deficits, but as potential stages being cleared for something much bigger than we could ever engineer ourselves.
And that leads us right to the final necessary question. The one posed by the source material itself, for you, the listener, to take away and contemplate, to explore further in your own context. What reduction in your life right now? What area of perceived weakness or loss might God be turning into a testimony of His power?